I was in church the other day and we took communion. And as I listened to the pastor read the words of institution from 1 Corinthians 11, I was reminded that this is one of the great passages where Greek word order really does make a difference, and it should affect how we read these words. You remember that what Jesus is doing is reinterpreting the Passover meal, and that's what's critical. So we look at 1 Corinthians 11, starting at verse 24, and after giving thanks, aorist participle, he broke, understood the bread from the context, and said, "This of me is the body." In other words, this bread, this is my body. And that's how you should be reading this passage. This is a very unusual placement of a personal pronoun. It almost always goes after the noun that it modifies. But the order is coming forward to make the point that we should be making when we read these words in church. This bread is my body, which is for you. Do this, and what's this? Well, this is the Passover meal. And he's saying that the bread is no longer pointing back to the Passover sacrifice. It's rather pointing to Jesus. And that's why this placement of the mu and how we should read this passage is really critical. This is my body, which is for you. You do this, in other words, you do your Passover, in remembrance of me. In other words, not in remembrance of the past act of salvation, but of Jesus's act of salvation. And I was going to say the same thing again. In the same way, also, the cup after supper, and you have to fill in the words, he took the cup after they'd finished eating, saying, "This cup," okay, this cup is the new covenant in the blood of me, in my blood. You do this. What is this? Well, it's the cup of the Passover ceremony. Do this as often as you drink. You notice we say something like drink it, but it's not there in the Greek. What is it? Well, it's drinking the cup, of course, but it's drinking the cup of the Passover in remembrance of me. And this is, by the way, it's one of those interesting things that we just do in language. And he's saying, as often as you drink the cup, well, you don't drink the cup, you drink the fluid that's in the cup. But we understand that. Language is approximate, let's say, many times. For as often as you eat this bread, what bread? Any bread? No, the Passover bread. And the cup. Drink. So in other words, for as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you are proclaiming the death of the Lord until he comes. What actually first caught my eye in the Greek is the translation of this ta. And I think that the NIV and the NLT get it right, that the article is functioning as a demonstrative paralleling the demonstrative here. It's not any cup, it's this cup. So whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup. So I think that the NIV and the NLT have done it properly. And the other translations tend to just say the here. But it's picking up the force of the demonstrative, and it's pointing back to the cup that he's been talking about. So a couple of things. One is that you have the flexibility of the article to function as a demonstrative, what it clearly is doing in this context. You have the role of common sense that as often as you drink, well, it's not as often as you drink. It's often as you drink the liquid in the cup in the Passover service, you're doing the remembrance of Jesus. But this is a fantastic example of, and this is more than just a nuance. Normally when we talk about word order, we're talking about how its effect on the meaning of this sentence is a nuance. But this is not a nuance. This is screaming. This of me is the body. And so please, when you read these words of institution, read them with the emphasis that Jesus certainly said this. And after giving thanks, he broke the bread and said, "This is my body, which is on behalf of you. Do this in the remembrance of me." I know there's a real debate on how often you should be taking the Lord's Supper, but I'm one of those people that thinks we should be doing this once a year. Why? Because Jesus did it as a reinterpretation of an annual festival. But as Dr. Stewart at Gordon Conwell pointed out to me, the church has always celebrated this much more frequently than once a year, and it was never stated to be wrong. So I'm not going to insist that it's once a year. But I've been in ceremonies in Scotland where it was done once a year, and you had 2 or 3 days of preparation for it. But it really brought Jesus' reinterpretation of the Passover home. But as in an annual ceremony, it was no longer looking back at God's great act of salvation in Egypt, but it's looking at the cross. And that's what we proclaim until he comes again. But please, read it properly. This is my body. Do this in remembrance of me.